As we approach chapter 2, I want you to think about something. There are things that are common to the human condition that just about everybody gets hurt by. There are also things that are very specific to different individuals. And those things many times are deeper even than the general things that we deal with. There's also something that's pretty common to humanity. When we get hurt, we feel a need to be able to judge other people. But in our society today, we keep hearing this mantra, don't judge, you can't judge. And that really ends up being an obstacle to us getting better and actually forgiving. I'm going to be talking about it in this chapter, but part of what makes forgiveness is actually right judgment. Right judgment actually starts with yourself, where you take a look at yourself, because sometimes when you're claiming woundedness, nothing's really happened, and you're actually being a little bit on the petty side. And so the judgment that needs to be happen is for you to take a good look at yourself. Sometimes the other person really has wounded you at a deep level, and our culture says that you can't say that anymore. And so then we come along and we just kind of come alongside someone else and say, "Oh, I know you really did something bad. Oh, I can't say that. Let's just kind of be okay with one another." Well, that just doesn't get the job done in forgiveness. So this chapter talks about sitting in the king's seat, moving into a place where I have to look at the consequences and I have to think through the consequences, and then I have to make a right decision. It's interesting to me that God Himself invites us in by telling us that if you forgive, they're forgiven. If you don't, they aren't. Who knows what to make of that? That one is actually a very difficult scripture. But we'll talk about that concept and many more as we get started with chapter 2. Chapter 2, Sitting in the King's Seat. When the dead dogs are barking, when a person is in pain from the wound of another, he seldom is focused on the heart of God for forgiveness. He just hurts. He feels violated and he wants it made right. There's a sense that somebody owes him and that there should be some sort of restitution. In a way, the one who has been wounded wants to sit in the king's seat and play judge, if only for a moment. If you forgive anyone his sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven. Jesus from John 20:23 in the NIV. Scholars argue a lot about this statement, but one thing seems clear. As human beings, we have some level of authority in the forgiveness process. But how can that be? In the words of those who constantly badger Jesus, who can forgive sins but God alone? That's from Mark 2:7b. We tend to spiritualize the wounding process and take it out of human hands for judgment, but no one can get past the instinctive sense that we are owed justice. It's part of the human psyche. It comes from being created in the very image of God, who is a God of justice. We feel it. We want to demand it. But then we hear about love and grace and our need to forgive, and we feel like we are something less than human if we don't abandon that inner call for justice. There is an incredible contradiction within, and we don't know what to do. A key to truly forgiving is not to fight against this inner need for justice, but to work with it. As human beings, we do sit in the king's seat. We do have a right to justice, much like the inalienable rights mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. And yet, somehow, we seem to have no right to judge. Listen to the words of Eli to his wicked sons. If one man sins against another, God will judge him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? That's from 1 Samuel 2:25. As our Creator, God does have the right to bring all things into judgment, and He will. Yet I believe Eli is making a point here that he doesn't intend to make. There are sins against other men, and there are sins against God. In the area of sins against God, nothing a man could do would make any difference. Only the death of Christ could atone for those. But most sins involve one man violating another, and as Eli indicates, there is a human atonement that is a part of the picture. As human beings, it is hard for us just to forget a situation when we feel we have been violated. We have a need to sit in the king's seat and see that justice is done. God knows what He is doing. If our sense of justice did not somehow fit with His purposes and with His heart, He would not have created us that way. God can actually use the desire we have to sit in the king's seat to fit His purposes. How? There is a human component of man's sin against man that is out of the hands of God. We generally think of God as being able to do whatever He wants to do, but that is not a complete picture. Can God save those who refuse to humble themselves and turn to Him for forgiveness? No. His hands are tied. He has given us His conditions for salvation, and if He were to break those conditions, He would be a liar just like Satan and his followers. God is absolutely tied to the covenants and to the word that He has spoken. He must be faithful to every word that He has spoken, and He must have integrity in every way. When God gave dominion over the earth to man in Genesis 1:26, He made man a king. He took him on as a partner in all things pertaining to the earth. God has responded to man in some extraordinary ways. Elijah stopped the rain and then spoke the word, and the rain started again. Joshua prayed, and the sun did not set for a whole day. When the city of Nineveh humbled itself and cried out for mercy, God responded to the prayers of the people. So, what does the idea that God gave dominion have to do with forgiveness? We actually play a very significant role in when and how God executes forgiveness. We have to. God has given us a great deal of authority in the process. He has tied His response to ours. In Matthew 16:19 and in Matthew 18:18, Jesus tells Peter, and figuratively the church, "And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Jesus validates the power that He has given to us. God has tied Himself to respond to what comes through us, what you bind or loose on earth. He has placed us in the king's seat. I don't know about you, but my natural response is, why would God do such a foolish thing? Why would He include us in the judgment and forgiveness process? Ephesians 3:10 tells us that one day the church will demonstrate to all the heavenly beings the great wisdom God had when He placed His faith in the church. And that will be especially true in this area of including man in the forgiveness process. When we cooperate with what God wants to do through our lives, human beings have an incredible capacity to demonstrate the love and mercy of God. There may be no deeper hurt than the violation a person feels when a spouse commits adultery. I have sat in the seat of counselor multiple times and watched the pain of a person who was forsaken for another woman, for another man, or even for a nude picture on a page. Before I understood the concept that we sit in the king's seat, I would challenge these people to forgive, and at best I would see minimal results. However, when I began to cooperate with the person's right to judge, I found that human beings do have an extraordinary ability to demonstrate love and mercy. To cooperate with our need to sit in the king's seat, I say something like this: "You have been violated. The covenant that the two of you have made together has been severed. If you choose to walk away from the marriage, you are free in terms of the covenant." You are not a transgressor of the covenant because it has already been broken by your spouse. The power lies in your hands. Do you desire to see this covenant restored? One part of this statement that is easily missed is the declaration of guilt. When one person sins against another person, he owes that person. He puts the other person in a position of authority over him. He puts the other person in the king's seat. Our society doesn't like that concept. We try to teach a guiltless forgiveness. If there is no true guilt, what is there to forgive? Part of what helps us get to a place where we can forgive is when there is a clear statement of guilt. The king in us needs to hear a clear pronouncement of the violation. That pronouncement is not vindictive, but it is just. When I bypass this step of putting the person in the king's seat by pronouncing guilt, the offended person was made to feel obligated to forgive. He or she felt pressured to stay in the marriage and would infer that staying was better or even the biblical thing to do. Those who are put in this position seldom are able to get over their hurt. We have a need to sit in the king's seat. Knowing my grandfather, I truly believe that if he had been put in the king's seat, there would have been a radically different outcome to his story. My grandfather would go to extraordinary lengths to help others, but he had a keen sense of justice. If the brothers had truly given him the opportunity, if they had empowered him to make the decision, I believe he would have willingly given up his rights to the 40 acres that became such a point of contention. Instead, his sense of justice was violated, and the dead dogs continued to accumulate for years. What I have found is that if people are truly allowed to sit in the king's seat, they are much more likely to offer forgiveness. Jesus did not take away that power, but he gave it to us in John 20:23. But the concept of being put in the king's seat goes a step farther. Most of us feel that when we release the person from judgment, it is as if there is a magic eraser that causes the event to just go away. That is not true. Jesus says, "But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." Matthew 12, verses 36 and 37. There is no divine eraser. It would better be described as a divine transfer. Those who come to Christ have their sins transferred to Jesus. The penalty is not eliminated, but transferred. And in the cross, we see the horrendous price that Jesus paid for us to enjoy our place of mercy. When a person sits in the king's seat, he understands that forgiveness doesn't make something evil disappear. Evil has an outcome. There is a cost. The king who lets a thief go with no penalty knows that he is sending a message to others in the society who might be considering stealing. In a king's world, every action has significant consequences that ripple throughout the kingdom. Before a king can forgive, he must consider the cost. He must understand the idea that somebody, somewhere, will pay the transfer payment. The person who has been a victim of adultery needs to see that there are two different worlds that hang in the balance with his choice. If he forgives and he stays with the person, he will have the cost of living with the very person who has hurt him so much and will continually need to submit those things that remind him of the old wound to the forgiveness process. If he chooses not to continue the marriage, he will have to deal with the realities of living as a divorced person, with the impact on the children and all of the things that go with that lifestyle. There is a real cost to sin. Which payment is the person willing to pay? The one to stay in the marriage or the one that comes with getting out of the marriage? We want to have a choice of none of the above. We want the choice with no consequences. Kings don't get to make that kind of choice. Kings don't get that kind of choice. When we are allowed to be a king, we can more easily deal with the consequences that will come. This is such an important concept. Along with guiltless forgiveness, our world believes in consequenceless forgiveness. The offended person needs to clearly see the two worlds that hang in the balance. Choice one, I stay closely connected to the world of the offender. Choice two, I sever my contact as much as possible. Consequences cannot be eliminated. They can be transferred from one human being to another or to God. Through our responses, the consequences of a single act can be multiplied or minimized. If a thief is released with no consequences, there still are consequences. The person who had his things stolen bears those consequences. Sometimes the release of an offender minimizes the consequences, and sometimes it multiplies the consequences. Kings are asked to take responsibility for making that choice and then to live without bitterness for the consequences they have helped shape. God gave us the right to be kings so that He could have partners in the kingdom. When we transfer a debt owed us to God, we transfer authority to Him to work in the king's life, that is, in the life of a human being. That is a very simple statement of how God can use even something as despicable as offenses to build His kingdom. I will describe this process in much more detail in the next chapter. Obviously, some exercise their kingly authority selfishly, but many will respond to the heart of God and exercise their authority to bring glory to the great King. With every decision we make, lives hang in the balance. The Matthew 16 consequences of whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven cannot be eliminated. If we neuter our authority in forgiveness, we just have to put up with hurt. And who wants to live that kind of life? But to live as a king, releasing authority to God and partnering with Him for good, I can rejoice in that kind of a vision and call. If my grandfather had understood this aspect of forgiveness, I believe many of the outcomes in his life would have been very different. Our culture has demanded forgiveness, taking away our rights as kings, and then lived with the result of wallowing in the stench of the dead dogs. There is a better way. Take your seat as a king, face reality, and start influencing this world for the glory of the King.